Beneath the rolling steppes of southern Russia lies a secret that's been hidden for 3,500 years. A network of tunnels stretching hundreds of kilometers underground. Thousands of vertical shafts plunging 40 meters into darkness. An industrial operation so massive it consumed 75 million metric tons of wood and scarred 140 square kilometers of landscape forever. This wasn't built by the Romans. It wasn't built by the Egyptians. It wasn't even built by any civilization you've learned about in school. Between 1900 and 1300 BC, someone extracted 150,000 tons of copper from this desolate landscape. That's enough metal to forge millions of weapons, tools, and artifacts. Enough wealth to build empires. Enough copper to change the course of human history. But here's what doesn't make sense. This mining complex sits in the middle of nowhere on the open steppes between the Ural Mountains and the Caspian Sea. No mountains. No obvious rock outcrops. Just grassland covering the bedrock with meters of earth. So how did Bronze Age people, armed with nothing but antler picks and stone hammers, discover copper deposits hidden 12 meters underground? How did they excavate a tunnel network that rivals modern mining operations? And where did all that copper actually go? The answers will take us from the barren steppes of Russia to the palaces of Minoan Crete and reveal an ancient trade network that connected civilizations across thousands of kilometers. This is the story of Kargali, the largest prehistoric copper mine in the world, and the mysterious people who built it. To understand why Kargali matters, you need to understand what copper meant in the Bronze Age. This wasn't just another metal. Copper, when mixed with tin to create bronze, was the most advanced technology on Earth. It was smartphones and nuclear weapons and oil reserves all rolled into one. Bronze tools were harder and held a sharper edge than stone. Bronze weapons could slice through leather armor like paper. Bronze enabled agriculture on a scale that fed growing populations. The civilizations that controlled copper sources didn't just survive, they dominated. Throughout Bronze Age Europe, copper mines were springing up wherever people found the telltale blue-green minerals of malachite and azurite. Along the Atlantic coasts from Ireland and Britain down to Brittany and Iberia, miners were extracting ore. In Wales, the Great Orme mine produced an impressive 2,000 tons of copper, enough to transform the British Isles and make its rulers extremely wealthy. In Central Europe, the mines of the Eastern Alps were even more productive. The richest mine there produced an estimated 20,000 tons of copper, enough to equip entire armies with swords, shields, and armor. In southern Europe, from the Balkans to the Aegean Islands and across to Anatolia, copper mines fueled the great civilizations of the Near East. The island of Cyprus became famous for its copper production, extracting and exporting distinctive oxide-shaped ingots to Egypt and Mesopotamia and right across the Mediterranean. The metal was so associated with Cyprus that we get the word copper from the Latin cuprum, meaning from Cyprus. But here's what archaeologists didn't expect. None of these famous mines, not the Great Orme, not the Alpine mines, not even Cyprus, were as large or as productive as a mining complex sitting at the furthest reaches of Europe, in a place so remote that most people have never heard of it, Kargali. Located on the open steppe landscape of the southern Urals in what's now Russia, this enormous mining center sprawls across 500 square kilometers along the valley of the river Kargalka, a tributary of the Ural River. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Archaeologists have identified an estimated 35,000 surface features connected to mining, thousands of mine shafts, drift mines, prospecting pits, and a labyrinth of underground tunnels. The underground network extended for hundreds of kilometers. Some tunnels reached depths of 40 meters and created excavated chambers up to 20 meters, 65 feet high. The exploratory workings left the landscape forever pitted with craters, like a lunar surface carved into the earth. And the output? Experts estimate that during the Bronze Age, Kargali produced up to 150,000 tons of copper. That's 7.5 times more than the Great Orme mine, 7 times more than the richest Alpine mine, more than all the other European copper sources combined. To put that in perspective, 150,000 tons of copper could produce approximately 150 million bronze axes or 50 million bronze swords. That's enough to arm every person in Bronze Age Europe multiple times over. So, who was conducting operations on this scale? The answer takes us back nearly 4,000 years to a culture that most history books barely mention. The first people to exploit Kargali's copper deposits were associated with the Repan culture, an early Yamnaya ceramic style unique to this region. Around 3,800 to 3,360 BC, they established a settlement 70 kilometers west of Kargali. Excavations revealed copper ore, slag, and copper tools, evidence that they were mining at Kargali and bringing the ore back for processing during the summers. But the Repan settlement was eventually abandoned. The real industrial-scale mining began after 3000 BC when the Yamnaya culture took over operations. The Yamnaya were mobile herders, semi-nomadic people who moved across the steppes with their cattle and sheep. But they were also skilled metal workers, extracting ore and making copper axes and knives. Their presence at Kargali is confirmed by the burial mounds kurgans they built in the area. One of these cemeteries revealed something particularly intriguing: the burial of a young man dated to approximately 2,900 to 2,700 BC. He was interred with valuable grave goods including a copper axe and an axe mold. The axe mold is especially significant. It's evidence that he had been a metal worker in life, someone important enough that his tools for creating copper weapons were buried with him. The Yamnaya worked Kargali for centuries, but their mining operations seem to have stopped after 2500 BC. For reasons we don't fully understand, Kargali went silent. The shafts were abandoned. The tunnels sat empty. For 600 years, no one extracted copper from what would become the world's largest prehistoric mine. Then, around 1900 BC, everything changed. A new culture arrived on the steppes, and they would transform Kargali into an industrial powerhouse that would influence civilizations from the Urals to Crete. This culture was called the Shrubnaya, which translates to timber grave culture in Russian, named after their distinctive burial practice of placing the dead in timber-lined grave chambers. Like the Yamnaya before them, the Shrubnaya were steppe herders, but they also established permanent settlements throughout the Pontic steppe, from the Urals all the way to the Black Sea coasts. The Shrubnaya weren't newcomers to mining. Their ancestors had been extracting copper from other sites in the southern Urals for centuries, and related cultures like the Abashevo to the northeast had become renowned experts in mining and copper working. They understood that copper was power, copper was wealth, and those who controlled copper sources could become extraordinarily powerful. When the Shrubnaya arrived at Kargali around 1900 BC, they didn't just resume the old Yamnaya operations. They expanded them on a scale that would have seemed impossible. For perhaps 6 centuries, until around 1300 BC, Kargali became the beating industrial heart of Bronze Age Eurasia. But here's the mystery that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. How did these Bronze Age people even discover the copper in the first place? When we think of mining, we automatically picture mountains and rock faces. That's where most prehistoric copper was discovered. Ancient prospectors would spot the distinctive blue-green minerals of malachite or azurite in rocky outcrops, follow the veins into the hillside, and begin excavation. But Kargali had no mountains, no convenient cliff faces, no obvious rock exposures. The bedrock is buried beneath many meters of alluvial soil and steppe grassland. You could walk across this landscape for days and never see a hint of the treasure hidden below. So how did the Yamnaya and later the Shrubnaya find copper deposits that were completely invisible from the surface? But there's another intriguing theory. Modern geologists have noticed that certain types of vegetation favor copper-rich environments. Specific plants actually thrive in soil with high copper content. It's just speculation, but perhaps Bronze Age prospectors learned to recognize these copper-loving plants and used them as natural indicators of ore deposits below. Imagine being a Shrubnaya prospector 3,800 years ago, walking across the seemingly endless steppe, reading the landscape like a book that no one else could understand. Noticing subtle differences in the grass, the wildflowers, the way certain plants clustered in specific areas. And knowing, somehow, that beneath your feet lay enough copper to forge the future. However they found it, the real challenge was just beginning. Because extracting copper from Kargali required solving an engineering problem that would tax even modern mining operations. The copper ore at Kargali is embedded in sandstone layers beneath the alluvial soils at depths of up to 12 meters, about 40 feet. The ore deposits then extend another 90 meters below the surface of the bedrock. To reach the copper, miners had to excavate huge amounts of earth just to find the ore-bearing sandstones beneath. Once they located a promising deposit, they dug vertical or inclined shafts 10 to 12 meters down through the overburden. And here's something remarkable. When modern archaeologists discovered and excavated these ancient shafts, they found handholds carved directly into the rock walls. Stop and picture that for a moment. Imagine being a Bronze Age miner climbing down a narrow shaft in complete darkness using only handholds chipped into the stone. You're descending 10, 11, 12 meters into the earth, the circle of daylight above you shrinking to a distant point. The air grows cooler, damper. You can smell the mineral-rich stone and the smoke from the oil lamps that provide your only light. At the bottom of the shaft, you begin the real work, tunneling outward in every direction, following the copper veins wherever they lead, sometimes down to depths of 40 meters. Sometimes creating chambers 20 meters high when you strike a particularly rich deposit. The Shrubnaya miners used the same kinds of tools that were employed 4,000 kilometers away at the Great Orme Mine in Wales, antler picks made from red deer antlers, bone picks fashioned from cattle bones, cattle shoulder blades shaped into shovels, and large stone hammers. They also manufactured bronze picks using copper to extract more copper, an investment that paid for itself many times over. The soft sandstone made the work somewhat easier than at other mines where harder rock required fire setting, heating the rock face with fires and then dousing it with water to create thermal fractures. But the soft rock also meant the tunnels were more prone to collapse. Supporting the roof required careful engineering and probably timber reinforcements, though these have long since rotted away. Where they struck it rich, the tunnel systems became extensive, creating a labyrinth of passages that often connected to one another. Archaeologists estimate there are several hundred kilometers of tunnels beneath Kargali's surface. You can still see evidence of the miners' work etched into the tunnel walls, the marks of bronze picks, the grooves from antler tools, the handholds carved for climbing. But here's the thing about mining on this scale. It doesn't just require labor and skill. It requires a massive support infrastructure. You need people extracting the ore, people hauling it to the surface, people processing it, people making tools, people providing food, people managing the entire operation. Archaeological evidence suggests around 20 settlements connected to the late Bronze Age mines at Kargali, but one stands out above all the others. The most extensively excavated settlement, called Gorni, was located on a low hill right inside the mining complex. Initially, when the settlement was founded, there were only pit dwellings occupied seasonally temporary structures for workers who came during the mining season and then left. But over time, this changed. They established permanent houses along with smelting facilities and ritual areas. Gorni transformed from a temporary camp into a year-round industrial center. The archaeological finds from Gorni are staggering. Excavators uncovered 120,000 pottery sherds from perhaps 6,000 ceramic vessels. They recovered approximately 2.5 million animal bones, mostly cattle, and they found 4,000 finds of copper objects from raw copper nuggets to finished metal work, along with 190 casting molds for producing axes, daggers, and the copper picks used in the mines themselves. This was where the initial stages of copper production happened. Workers crushed the ore with hammer stones, sorted out the high-grade minerals for smelting, and began the process of transforming rock into metal. Some smelting was done right at Gorney, but here's where they ran into a problem that would ultimately doom the entire operation. Creating 1 kilogram, about 2.2 pounds of copper ingot required burning 65 kilograms of charcoal. That charcoal came from approximately 500 kilograms of dry wood. When you're processing copper on an industrial scale, those numbers become terrifying. Experts estimate that Cargill consumed 75 million metric tons of wood during its operational period. 75 million metric tons of wood. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to clear-cutting an area the size of Connecticut. Twice. The Shrubnai didn't have modern forestry equipment. They didn't have chainsaws or logging trucks. They had bronze axes and human labor, and they systematically consumed every tree within practical hauling distance of Cargill. This created a cascading problem. As the local forests disappeared, workers had to travel farther and farther to find fuel for the smelting furnaces. Eventually, it became more efficient to ship the raw ore away from Cargill to regions that still had wood, rather than transporting wood to the mine. Archaeological evidence shows that much of Cargill's ore was exported south and west for smelting in areas where forests still stood. The mine became primarily an extraction operation, feeding a vast network of smelting sites scattered across the steppes. But the environmental devastation didn't stop with deforestation. Copper smelting is a toxic process. The furnaces released sulfur dioxide and other pollutants into the air. Slag heaps the waste rock from smelting operations piled up around the settlements, leaching heavy metals into the soil and water. The landscape around Cargill became a poisoned wasteland, scarred by thousands of mining pits and choked with industrial waste. And yet, for 6 centuries, the operation continued, because the wealth generated by Cargill was simply too enormous to abandon. Living at Gorney during the peak of Cargill's production must have been like experiencing a Bronze Age boom town. Imagine the Wild West gold rush, but 3,500 years earlier and focused on copper instead of gold. Or perhaps more accurately, imagine one of those horrific modern cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where desperate workers extract the minerals needed for our smartphone and electric vehicle batteries under brutal conditions. There would have been a rigid hierarchy. Rulers and overseers who controlled the operation and reaped the greatest rewards. Skilled workers, the experienced miners who knew how to follow the copper veins, the metal workers who could transform ore into ingots, the craftsmen who cast tools and weapons. Below them, common laborers doing the backbreaking work of hauling ore and processing material. And almost certainly slaves, captives from rival tribes, debtors, or conquered peoples forced to work in the most dangerous conditions. The 2.5 million animal bones found at Gorney tell their own story. Mostly cattle bones, in numbers that far exceed what the local population would need for food alone. Some archaeologists speculate these cattle were brought in as a form of payment, essentially currency on the hoof. Workers and traders from across the steppes would arrive at Cargill with cattle to exchange for copper, creating a bustling market economy centered on metal. The excavations also revealed something darker, features interpreted as ritual sites associated with mass sacrifices. There's evidence of enormous feasts where dozens of cattle were slaughtered at once. Many pits throughout the settlement contain what archaeologists identify as ritual deposits, carefully arranged objects, animal remains, and offerings. Most intriguingly, excavators found numerous stone objects carved to resemble phalluses, deliberately inserted upright into the ground throughout the settlement. Now, there's a running joke in archaeology that whenever someone can't explain something, they label it ritual. But in the context of ancient mining, ritual activity makes perfect sense. Mining is inherently dangerous. You're descending into the earth, into darkness, into the realm of chthonic deities and underworld spirits. You're literally invading the domain of the Earth Mother, extracting her treasures from her body. Bronze Age peoples would have believed this required appeasement, propitiation, and protection. The fertility symbolism of the stone phalluses makes sense in this context. Their offerings to the earth goddess, perhaps asking permission to continue the extraction, perhaps ensuring the mine remains fertile and continues producing ore. Miners across cultures and throughout history have left offerings in their mines and carefully backfilled exhausted shafts rather than leaving them open. Why backfill a shaft you're done with? It requires extra labor, extra time. The practical answer is safety, preventing people or animals from falling in. But there's likely a deeper reason. You don't want to leave a gaping wound in the Earth's body. You don't want to create an open portal through which something from below might emerge. Better to close it properly, seal it with earth, and move on. This mixture of pragmatic industrial activity and profound spiritual anxiety would have permeated every aspect of life at Kargali. The miners understood they were doing something unnatural, something that violated the normal order of the world, and they took steps to protect themselves from the consequences. But here's what makes Kargali truly significant. The copper flowing out of these mines didn't just supply local populations. It traveled thousands of kilometers, reaching civilizations that had no idea where their metal actually came from. For decades, archaeologists assumed they knew where Bronze Age copper came from. The Minoans of Crete got their copper from Cyprus. It was right there in the name. The distinctive oxide-shaped ingots found throughout the Mediterranean were obviously Cypriot copper, exported from the island's famous mines. Everyone knew this. It was established fact, until scientists started actually testing the copper. Modern archaeometallurgy can trace the origins of copper artifacts by analyzing their chemical compositions. Different copper sources have unique chemical fingerprints, trace elements, and lead isotope ratios that act like a geological DNA signature. By comparing artifacts to or samples from known mines, researchers can determine where the metal actually came from. And here's the twist: the earliest known oxide ingots found on Minoan Crete weren't from Cyprus at all. The copper in these ingots, dating to between 1550 and 1450 BC, came from the southern Urals region, from Kargali. Think about what that means. Copper extracted from mines on the Russian steppes, more than 3,000 kilometers from Crete, was being transported across one of the most sophisticated trade networks in the ancient world. This wasn't just regional trade. This was Bronze Age globalization. The logistics are mind-boggling. The copper probably traveled across or around the Caucasus Mountains into the Mitanni Kingdom in what's now northern Syria. From there, it would have been shipped to Cyprus, where it might have been reformed into the distinctive oxide ingot shape before being exported to Crete. Or it traveled through Anatolia and directly to Crete by ship. After 1400 BC, all known copper oxide ingots can be traced to Cyprus. It's possible that Cypriot metal workers saw these foreign ingots, recognized the utility of their shape for handles for easy carrying, stackable, standardized weight, and began producing their own. The oxide ingot became a kind of brand, a Cypriot trademark recognized throughout the Mediterranean. But during that earlier period, from roughly 1550 to 1450 BC, Kargali copper was flowing into the heart of Minoan civilization. The Minoans were building their palaces, creating their sophisticated art, developing their still undeciphered linear script, all fueled in part by copper from a mine so distant they probably didn't even know it existed. This reveals something profound about Bronze Age trade networks. We often think of ancient peoples as isolated, their world limited to their immediate region. But the Bronze Age was an interconnected world, with trade routes spanning thousands of kilometers, linking the Atlantic coast to the Urals, the Baltic Sea to Egypt. Kargali's copper flowed west and south into these networks, transforming from raw ore into ingots, from ingots into tools and weapons, from objects into wealth and power. A copper axe forged in the Levant might contain metal extracted by a Shrubnaya miner who died centuries before. A Minoan bronze dagger might be made from ore hauled up from darkness by a slave whose name was never recorded. The people working at Kargali probably had no idea where their copper ultimately ended up. The miners extracting ore 40 meters underground couldn't have imagined their metal would travel to island palaces in the Mediterranean. They were just doing their jobs, following the copper veins, hauling the ore to the surface, earning their payment in cattle or grain or whatever currency operated in their world. And yet, their labor helped build civilizations they would never see and whose names they would never hear. For 6 centuries, from approximately 1900 to 1300 BC, Kargali's mines produced copper at an industrial scale unmatched anywhere else in the prehistoric world. The Shrubnaya culture flourished, spreading across the Pontic steppe from the Urals to the Black Sea. Their settlements, their burial mounds, their metal work, all of it enabled by the wealth flowing from Kargali's tunnels. And then, suddenly, it ended. Around 1300 BC, the mining operations at Kargali ceased. The shafts were abandoned. The settlements were deserted. The greatest copper mine in the prehistoric world went silent. What happened? The answer involves a convergence of catastrophes that affected not just Kargali but the entire Bronze Age world. The most immediate problem was the one we've already discussed: fuel exhaustion. The forests around Kargali were gone, consumed by 6 centuries of relentless smelting. Transporting ore to distant smelting sites was inefficient and expensive. The economic model that had sustained the operation for so long was breaking down. But there was something larger happening, something that affected civilizations across the entire Near East and Mediterranean. The period around 1200 BC saw widespread climatic changes, droughts, crop failures, famines. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries were disrupted. Large-scale migrations swept across regions as peoples fled failing agricultural systems. This is the period of the Bronze Age collapse, when the great civilizations of the late Bronze Age, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Mitanni, either collapsed entirely or were severely weakened. The sophisticated trade networks that had carried Kargali's copper to distant markets were breaking down. On the steppes, the Shrubnaya culture was itself coming to an end. By about 1200 BC, they were being replaced by new peoples, new cultures. The demand for copper and bronze was fading as iron technology began its slow spread across Eurasia. The Iron Age was beginning, and in this new world, the great copper mines of the Bronze Age were becoming relics. Kargali's scarred, poisoned landscape was left to nature. The mine shafts gradually filled with sediment. The tunnels collapsed. Vegetation slowly, painfully reclaimed the devastated earth. The settlements crumbled. The slag heaps weathered. The burial mounds stood as silent monuments to a vanished people. For approximately 3,000 years, Kargali sat abandoned. Forgotten? The Scythians who later dominated the steppes probably rode past without realizing what lay beneath their horses' hooves. The Mongol hordes that swept across these lands in the medieval period had no idea they were passing over the greatest prehistoric mine in the world. Until the 18th century, when Russian prospectors, armed with new geological knowledge and modern mining techniques, rediscovered the copper deposits. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, Russian mining operations extracted another 130,000 tons of copper from Kargali, nearly as much as the entire Bronze Age operation had produced. These modern miners would have found evidence of the ancient workings everywhere. They would have broken into prehistoric tunnels, found ancient tools, seen the marks of antler picks on tunnel walls. They probably dismissed it as the work of some forgotten local tribe, never imagining the true scale and significance of what they'd discovered. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists began to understand what Kargali really was. Systematic surveys and excavations revealed the extent of the mining operations, the settlements, the cultural context. Chemical analysis of artifacts found throughout Europe and the Near East traced their copper back to this remote source. Kargali transformed from a footnote in Russian archaeological reports to one of the most significant industrial sites in prehistoric Europe. The numbers that emerged from the research were staggering: 35,000 surface features, hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, 150,000 tons of Bronze Age copper production, 75 million tons of wood consumed, trade connections spanning 3,000 kilometers. Standing on the Kargali steppes today, you can still see the evidence of Bronze Age industry etched into the landscape. The land is pitted with depressions where ancient shafts collapsed. The river valleys show traces of the settlements that once thrived here. If you know where to look, you can find fragments of Bronze Age pottery, corroded copper artifacts, the occasional stone tool. But what you're really seeing is something more profound. Evidence of human ambition, ingenuity, and exploitation on a scale that we usually associate only with modern industrial civilization. The people who worked at Kargali weren't primitive savages scratching out a subsistence existence. They were part of a sophisticated society that understood geology, engineering, metallurgy, and trade. They developed techniques to find copper deposits hidden beneath meters of earth. They excavated tunnel systems that would be impressive even by modern standards. They created trade networks that spanned a continent. And they did it all with Bronze Age technology: antler picks, stone hammers, bone shovels, and bronze tools. No explosives, no mechanical drilling, no electric lighting, no industrial machinery. Just human labor, human intelligence, and human determination to extract wealth from the earth regardless of the cost. That cost was considerable. The environmental devastation around Kargali was extreme: forests destroyed, landscape scarred, soil and water poisoned by mining waste. The human cost was probably even higher. We don't know how many people died in tunnel collapses, how many miners were killed by accidents or exhaustion, how many slaves lived and died in the darkness without anyone recording their names. What we do know is that their labor created the wealth that powered Bronze Age civilizations across Eurasia. The copper they extracted became the tools that cleared forests and tilled fields. It became the weapons that equipped armies and decided the outcomes of battles. It became the luxury items that signified status and power. It became currency, enabling trade and economic development. In a very real sense, the miners of Kargali helped build the Bronze Age world. They just didn't live long enough to see it or understand their role in it. The story of Kargali forces us to reconsider our assumptions about prehistoric peoples. We tend to think of the ancient world as a simpler place where people lived in small, isolated communities, their horizons limited to what they could see from the nearest hilltop. But Kargali reveals a different reality. The Bronze Age was a time of globalized trade, industrial-scale production, and sophisticated economic systems. Copper from the Russian steppes reached Minoan palaces in Crete. Amber from the Baltic traveled to Egypt. Tin from Cornwall in Britain was transported to the Near East. The ancient world was connected in ways that wouldn't be matched again until the age of exploration thousands of years later. And at the heart of this interconnected world were places like Kargali industrial centers that we've only recently begun to understand and appreciate. There are probably other sites like this waiting to be discovered, other stories of prehistoric industry and trade that will force us to revise our understanding of ancient history. The miners of Kargali left us two legacies. The first is physical: the copper they extracted, some of which still exists in museums and private collections, transformed and reformed countless times over millennia, but ultimately traceable back to these remote steppes. The second legacy is conceptual, proof that our ancestors were capable of organizing complex operations on a scale we've only recently given them credit for. They weren't just survivors. They were builders, traders, engineers, and industrialists. They transformed landscapes and created wealth. They connected distant civilizations and enabled cultural exchange across vast distances. They were, in every meaningful sense, us, just with different technology. The tunnels of Kargali are mostly collapsed now, the shafts filled with sediment, the settlements reduced to subtle variations in soil color visible only from aerial surveys. But the story they tell remains vitally important. It's a story about human ingenuity and ambition, about the price we're willing to pay for wealth and progress, about the connections that bind civilizations together across time and distance. It's a story that started 3,800 years ago on the steppes of Russia, reached its climax in the palaces of Bronze Age Crete, and continues today as archaeologists piece together the evidence and reveal the true scale of prehistoric achievement. The miners of Kargali are long dead. Their names are forgotten. Their language is lost. But their legacy persists in every Bronze Age artifact that owes its existence to the copper they extracted from darkness, hauled to the surface, and sent out into a world they would never see but helped create nonetheless. That's the real lesson of Kargali, that ordinary people doing difficult, dangerous work in remote places can change the course of history, even if they never know it. And somewhere beneath the steppes of southern Russia, in the darkness of collapsed tunnels that haven't seen light for 3,000 years, the marks of their tools are still etched into the stone walls. Silent testimony to the people who built the Bronze Age, one copper vein at a time,